When America's banks collapsed in 1929, families didn't just lose their savings. They lost their way of life, their security, and often their next meal. The Great Depression wasn't just an economic crisis. It was a survival test that lasted over a decade. In this exploration of 25 cheap recipes we ate to get through the Great Depression, we'll uncover the ingenious ways families stretched every penny and made miracles from scraps. Depression cake. Also known as wacky cake or crazy cake, this dessert proved that you could make cake without eggs, butter, or milk, ingredients that were often too expensive for everyday use during the Depression. The cake used vinegar and baking soda to create lift, while oil or melted shortening provided richness. The ingredients were simple: flour, sugar, cocoa powder, baking soda, salt, water, oil, and vinegar. Everything would be mixed together in the baking pan itself, eliminating the need for extra bowls and making cleanup easier. The result was a moist chocolate cake that tasted much richer than its humble ingredients suggested. Depression cake became a symbol of resilience and creativity. Families discovered that you didn't need expensive ingredients to create something that felt special and celebratory. Children learned that birthdays and holidays could still be marked with cake, even when money was tight. The cake proved that joy didn't have to be expensive, and that sometimes the most memorable treats came from making the best of difficult circumstances. Dandelion salad. Those yellow flowers dotting your yard weren't weeds to Depression-era families. They were free groceries growing right outside the door. Dandelion salad became a staple when store-bought vegetables were luxuries most couldn't afford. Mothers would send children out with baskets to gather the tender young leaves before the flowers bloomed, knowing that older leaves would be too bitter to stomach. The preparation was simple but strategic. Fresh dandelion greens were washed thoroughly and mixed with whatever was available. A splash of vinegar, a pinch of salt, maybe some wild onions if you were lucky. Some families added hard-boiled eggs when the chickens were laying well, turning this humble green into a complete meal. The slightly bitter taste reminded everyone that survival sometimes required swallowing your pride, along with whatever nature provided. Hoover Stew. Named sarcastically after President Herbert Hoover, this dish represented both desperation and defiance. Hoover Stew wasn't really a stew at all. It was whatever you could scrape together thrown into a pot with water and hope. Families created their own versions based on what they could find, borrow, or trade for. A typical Hoover stew might contain wilted vegetables rescued from behind the grocery store, a few potatoes with eyes cut out, some questionable meat scraps, and enough water to make it stretch for the whole family. The beauty of Hoover stew lay in its flexibility. No two pots were ever the same, and no one could criticize your recipe because everyone was making do with whatever they had. The name itself was a form of resistance. By calling it after the president many blamed for their troubles, families were making a statement with every spoonful. They were saying that if the government couldn't feed them, they'd feed themselves, even if it meant eating the political commentary along with their dinner. Hot water cornbread. When buttermilk, eggs, and oil were luxuries, hot water cornbread proved that you could still make fresh bread with just cornmeal, salt, and boiling water. This simple flatbread could be cooked on a griddle or in a skillet, providing fresh, warm bread when store-bought options were impossible to afford. The process was quick and required no special equipment. Cornmeal would be mixed with salt, then boiling water would be stirred in until the mixture formed a thick batter. The batter would be shaped into patties and cooked on a hot, greased surface until golden brown on both sides. The result was a crispy exterior with a soft, corn-flavored interior. Hot water cornbread represented self-sufficiency and the ability to create comfort food from the most basic ingredients. The warm bread could make any meal feel more complete, and the simple preparation meant that even children could help make it. Families took pride in their ability to create fresh bread when everything else seemed scarce. Scrapple. Long before the Depression, German immigrants brought Scrapple to America, but hard times made this thrifty dish a necessity rather than a choice. Scrapple embodied the philosophy of using absolutely everything: cornmeal, mixed with pork scraps, organs, and whatever meat couldn't be used elsewhere, all formed into a loaf and sliced for frying. Making scrapple was a communal effort that happened after butchering day, when families couldn't afford to waste even the smallest pieces of meat. Women would gather around large pots, stirring the mixture while it cooked, sharing stories and strategies for making their supplies last longer. The finished product would be stored in cool cellars, providing protein for weeks when fresh meat was impossible to afford. Eating scrapple required a certain mental adjustment. You learned not to ask too many questions about what went into it. Children were told it was farmer's choice or country loaf, anything to make it sound more appealing than everything we couldn't use for anything else. The crispy exterior and hearty interior filled empty stomachs and provided the energy needed for long days of work or searching for work. Bacon and onion sandwich. When meat became precious, every strip of bacon was treated like gold. The bacon and onion sandwich stretched a single slice of bacon into a satisfying meal through clever preparation and generous helpings of whatever was free or cheap. One strip would be fried slowly, rendering every drop of fat, then removed while the onions cooked in the precious grease. The onions, often the only vegetables families could consistently afford, would caramelize in the bacon fat, absorbing all those rich flavors while adding their own sweetness. Meanwhile, the bacon would be chopped into tiny pieces and distributed evenly across thick slices of homemade bread. Each bite delivered the promise of meat, while the onions provided the substance. This sandwich represented the art of making less seem like more. Families developed rituals around it: the careful ceremony of cooking the bacon, the patient waiting as onions transformed from sharp to sweet, the precise distribution of ingredients to ensure everyone got their fair share. It was a lesson in making the most of what you had, while never forgetting the value of what you were using. Fried potato skins. Before potato skins became a trendy restaurant appetizer, Depression families knew the value of every part of the potato. When potatoes were peeled for other dishes, the skins went into a separate bowl, never the trash. These scraps would be carefully cleaned, seasoned with salt and whatever spices were available, then fried until crispy. The process was simple, but the results were surprisingly satisfying. Potato skins fried in bacon grease or whatever oil could be spared became crunchy vessels for the potato flavor that would otherwise have been wasted. Children learned to look forward to these treats, not knowing they were eating what wealthier families would have thrown away. Fried potato skins taught families that luxury could be found in unexpected places. The contrast between the crispy exterior and the soft potato flesh that still clung to the skin provided texture and flavor that could make any meal feel more complete. They were proof that with enough creativity and respect for your ingredients, nothing had to be waste. Baked beans. The humble bean became a cornerstone of Depression-era survival, and baked beans represented the perfect marriage of economy and nutrition. Dried beans were cheap, stored well, and provided protein when meat was scarce. A pot of baked beans could feed a family for days, and the recipe could be adjusted based on what else was available. The basic formula was simple: beans, water, and thyme. But families found ways to enhance the flavor with whatever they had. A spoonful of molasses if sugar was available, some bacon grease if there'd been bacon recently, or just salt and pepper if nothing else could be spared. The long, slow cooking process filled the house with aromas that made everyone forget how little they actually had to eat. Baked beans were also social food. Neighbors would share ingredients. One family might contribute the beans, another some molasses, and a third the fuel for cooking. Large pots would simmer in shared ovens, creating community bonds along with dinner. Children would carry bowls between houses, trading portions, and ensuring everyone had something warm to eat, even when individual families couldn't make a complete meal on their own. Potato soup. Potatoes were reliable, affordable, and filling, making potato soup a cornerstone of Depression-era cooking. A single pot could feed a large family, and the recipe was flexible enough to accommodate whatever other ingredients might be available. The key was building flavor through careful preparation and seasoning. The potatoes would be peeled and diced, then cooked in water or broth until tender. Some would be mashed to thicken the soup, while others were left whole for texture. Onions were added when available, and milk or cream would be stirred in at the end if dairy could be afforded. Salt, pepper, and herbs completed the simple but satisfying dish. Potato soup taught families about the value of mastering basic techniques. Learning to balance the thickness, seasoning, and texture required practice, but once mastered, the skill could be applied to other ingredients as they became available. The soup could be dressed up with bacon, cheese, or chives when times were better, or served plain when they weren't. Mulligan stew. Born in hobo camps but adopted by struggling families everywhere, Mulligan stew represented the ultimate in cooperative cooking. The concept was simple. Everyone contributed whatever they could find, and together, it became a meal that could feed more people than any individual contribution could have managed alone. Railroad workers and traveling men perfected the art of Mulligan stew, but families adapted it for their own kitchens during the worst years of the Depression. One family might contribute potatoes, another some questionable meat, a third whatever vegetables they could spare. The stew would simmer all day, with people adding ingredients as they became available, creating something that was always changing, but always filling. The beauty of Mulligan stew was that it couldn't fail. Whatever went in became part of the flavor profile. Overripe vegetables added sweetness, tough meat became tender with long cooking, and bones contributed richness to the broth. It was democracy in a pot, where every ingredient had value, and every contributor had a stake in the final result. Garbage soup. The name might not sound appealing, but garbage soup represented the pinnacle of Depression-era resourcefulness. This wasn't soup made from garbage. It was soup made from everything that might otherwise have become garbage. Vegetable peelings, bones from previous meals, leftover scraps, and anything else that still had nutritional value found new life in the soup pot. Making garbage soup was an art form that required timing and intuition. The pot would start with bones and scraps, slowly building flavor through long simmering. As the week progressed, new ingredients would join the mix. Potato peels, carrot tops, onion skins, the water from cooking other vegetables. Each addition required judgment about what would enhance the flavor and what might ruin it. Children learned valuable lessons from watching their mothers make garbage soup. They discovered that things weren't worthless just because someone else might throw them away. They learned to see potential where others saw waste, and to understand that survival often meant finding new purposes for things others had finished using. Rabbit stew. When families couldn't afford store-bought meat, many turned to rabbits, animals that reproduce quickly, ate scraps, and provided protein for the pot. Rabbit stew became common, not just because rabbits were available, but because the stew could be stretched with vegetables and made to last for several meals. Preparing rabbit stew required skills that many urban families had to learn quickly. The rabbits had to be cleaned and butchered, a process that was difficult but necessary for survival. The meat was lean and flavorful, but it needed long, slow cooking to become tender. Root vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and onions were added to make the meal more substantial and to absorb the rich flavors of the broth. For many families, rabbit stew represented a connection to older ways of living, when people were more directly involved in producing their own food. Children who had never seen where their food came from suddenly learned about the realities of turning animals into meals. It was often their first lesson in understanding that survival sometimes required doing things that were uncomfortable but necessary. Poor man's pudding. Dessert seemed like an impossible luxury during the Depression, but poor man's pudding proved that sweetness could be found even in the hardest times. Made from stale bread, milk when it was available, eggs if the chickens were laying, and whatever sweetener could be found, this pudding transformed leftover ingredients into something that felt like a treat. The key to poor man's pudding was patience and creativity. Stale bread would be soaked until it broke apart, then mixed with whatever liquid was available: milk, water, or even the liquid from canned fruits if a family had been lucky enough to afford some. A bit of sugar, molasses, or honey would provide sweetness, and spices like cinnamon or nutmeg would make it feel special. Children looked forward to poor man's pudding because it represented hope. Even when dinner had been nothing more than soup and bread, the promise of pudding afterward made everything seem more bearable. It taught families that treats didn't have to be expensive to be meaningful, and that sometimes the best desserts came from making the most of what you already had. Cornmeal pudding. Cornmeal was cheap, filling, and versatile, making it a staple ingredient for families trying to stretch their food budgets. Cornmeal pudding could serve as breakfast, dinner, or dessert depending on how it was prepared and what was added to it. The basic recipe was simple enough that even children could help prepare it. Sweet versions of cornmeal pudding used molasses or sugar to create something that felt like dessert, while savory versions incorporated vegetables or small amounts of meat to create a substantial main dish. The pudding could be eaten warm from the pot or allowed to cool and set, then sliced and fried for a different texture and flavor. Making cornmeal pudding required careful attention to prevent lumps and burning, but the process was forgiving enough that even inexperienced cooks could succeed. The slow stirring required to make smooth pudding became a meditative activity, a time for family members to talk about their day or share plans for making their situation better. Bread pudding. Stale bread was never thrown away during the Depression. It was too valuable to waste. Bread pudding transformed hard, dry bread into something soft, sweet, and satisfying. Every household had their own version, depending on what other ingredients were available, but the basic principle remained the same. Nothing edible should ever be wasted. The process started with breaking up stale bread and soaking it in whatever liquid could be spared. Milk was ideal, but water with a bit of butter or even coffee could work in desperate times. Eggs would be beaten in if they were available, along with any sweetener that could be found. Raisins, nuts, or pieces of fruit would be added if the family had been particularly fortunate. Bread pudding represented the transformation of something that seemed useless into something desirable. Children learned to save bread crusts and ends, knowing they would eventually become part of something special. The warm, custardy texture and sweet flavor made it feel like a reward for being careful with resources. Rice pudding. Rice was affordable and filling, making it perfect for families trying to make their food budget stretch. Rice pudding could be made with just rice, milk, and sugar, but Depression families learned to enhance it with whatever else was available. The result was a creamy, comforting dish that could serve as breakfast, dinner, or dessert. The key to good rice pudding was slow cooking and patience. The rice needed time to absorb the liquid and release its starch, creating the creamy texture that made the dish satisfying. Cinnamon, vanilla, or other spices would add flavor when they were available, but even plain rice pudding was better than no dessert at all. Rice pudding also taught families about the value of simple ingredients prepared with care. The transformation of plain rice into something creamy and sweet seemed almost magical to children who were used to meals that were purely functional. It proved that with enough time and attention, even the most basic ingredients could become something special. Hot water pie. When butter, eggs, and cream were luxuries most families couldn't afford, hot water pie proved that you could still make dessert with almost nothing. This pie used hot water instead of expensive dairy products, creating a custard-like filling that was surprisingly satisfying given its humble ingredients. The filling combined flour, sugar, and hot water with whatever flavoring could be found. Vanilla extract if you were lucky, lemon juice if you had access to citrus, or just a pinch of salt to enhance the sweetness. The mixture would be poured into a simple pastry crust and baked until set, creating something that looked and tasted like a real dessert. Hot water pie represented the triumph of ingenuity over circumstance. Families discovered that you didn't need expensive ingredients to create something that felt like a treat. Children would watch in amazement as simple ingredients transformed into something that seemed impossible, given what had gone into it. Vinegar pie. When lemons were too expensive for lemon pie, vinegar stepped in to provide the tart flavor that made desserts interesting. Vinegar pie might sound unappetizing, but when prepared correctly, the vinegar's acidity was balanced by sugar and eggs to create something surprisingly similar to lemon custard pie. The key was using the right kind of vinegar and balancing it carefully with other ingredients. Apple cider vinegar worked best, providing a fruity undertone that complemented the sweetness. The filling would be cooked slowly until it thickened, then poured into a pie crust and baked until golden. Vinegar pie taught families that substitution could work in unexpected ways. The sharp flavor that made vinegar unsuitable for drinking became an asset when balanced with sweetness. Children learned that ingredients could have multiple purposes, and that creativity in the kitchen could produce results that defied expectations. Creamed chipped beef on toast, known less politely as SOS, by military personnel. Creamed chipped beef on toast became a staple for families trying to make a small amount of meat feed everyone. The dried, salted beef was reconstituted in a cream sauce and served over toast, creating a meal that felt substantial even when meat was scarce. The process started with soaking the dried beef to remove excess salt, then tearing it into small pieces. A simple cream sauce made from flour, butter when available, and milk would be prepared, and the beef would be stirred in. The mixture would be ladled over thick slices of toast, creating a meal that combined protein, carbohydrates, and enough flavor to be satisfying. This dish represented the military-style efficiency that many families adopted during the Depression. It was quick to prepare, used ingredients that stored well, and could be made in large quantities to feed everyone. The combination of salty meat and creamy sauce appealed to both adults and children, making it a reliable option when other meals might be rejected. Hamburger gravy. When ground beef was available but needed to be stretched to feed the whole family, hamburger gravy transformed a small amount of meat into a sauce that could cover potatoes, rice, or bread. The key was browning the meat thoroughly to develop flavor, then using the rendered fat to make a gravy that would carry that flavor throughout the dish. A small amount of ground beef would be cooked until well browned, then flour would be stirred in to absorb the fat and create a roux. Milk or water would be added gradually to create a smooth gravy, and seasonings would be adjusted to taste. The result was a rich, meaty sauce that made simple starches feel like complete meals. Hamburger Gravy taught families about the power of technique to multiply flavors. The browning process created depth that made the small amount of meat taste like much more. Children learned that the way you cooked something was often as important as what you were cooking, and that skill could compensate for limited ingredients. Stone soup. The classic folktale of stone soup became reality for many Depression families, who learned that cooperation could create abundance from scarcity. The concept was simple. Start with nothing more than water and a stone, then convince neighbors to contribute small amounts until everyone had enough to eat. In practice, stone soup represented the community bonds that helped families survive the hardest times. One family would start a pot with water and whatever they could spare, maybe just some salt and a few vegetables. Word would spread through the neighborhood, and others would add ingredients as they could. The result was always better than what any individual family could have created alone. Stone soup wasn't really about the stone. It was about creating reasons for people to work together when everyone was struggling. The ritual of making something from nothing brought communities together and ensured that even the poorest families had access to at least one good meal. Children learned that sometimes asking for help was the smartest strategy for survival. Egg drop soup. Eggs were precious during the Depression, but when they were available, egg drop soup stretched a single egg into a meal that could feed several people. The technique involved slowly drizzling beaten egg into hot broth, creating silky strands that made the soup feel substantial and protein-rich. The base could be as simple as hot water with salt and whatever seasonings were available, though chicken broth made from bones and scraps was preferred when possible. The egg would be beaten thoroughly, then slowly poured into the simmering liquid, while stirring constantly to create the characteristic egg ribbons that gave the soup its name. This soup represented the art of making simple ingredients elegant through technique. The process of creating the egg ribbons required skill and timing, but the results looked and tasted much more sophisticated than the ingredients suggested. Families took pride in mastering techniques that made their humble meals feel special. Slimgullion. This one-pot meal combined whatever was available into something that was always different but always edible. Slimgullion had no fixed recipe. It was a cooking philosophy that said anything could work if you approached it with confidence and creativity. The name itself suggested something that might not look appetizing, but would certainly fill empty stomachs. A typical Slimgullion might include pasta, rice, or potatoes as a base. Then, whatever vegetables, meat scraps, or canned goods could be found. Everything would be cooked together until tender, creating a dish that was part stew, part casserole, and entirely practical. Seasonings would be adjusted based on what the mixture needed to taste good. The beauty of Slimgullion was that it couldn't fail. Whatever you added became part of the character of that particular batch. Families developed confidence in their ability to create meals from whatever was available, knowing that technique and seasoning could make almost anything palatable. Ketchup glazed meat patties. Sometimes the simplest preparations produce the most satisfying results. These ketchup glazed patties were proof that you didn't need expensive ingredients to create a meal that felt special. The sweet, tangy glaze elevated simple ground beef patties into something that made children clean their plates without complaint. The patties were formed by hand, seasoned with salt, pepper, and breadcrumbs for binding. They were browned first to develop flavor, then glazed with a mixture of ketchup, brown sugar, and vinegar that caramelized beautifully in the oven. The result was meat patties with a glossy, flavorful coating that made them look as good as they tasted. The glaze provided the perfect balance of sweet and tangy flavors that complemented the savory beef perfectly. Served with mashed potatoes and green beans, they created a meal that felt complete and satisfying, proving that simple ingredients could create extraordinary memories. Beef Jambalaya bake. Southern comfort met practical cooking in this hearty casserole that brought the flavors of Louisiana to kitchen tables across America. Unlike traditional jambalaya that required constant stirring and attention, this baked version was perfect for busy mothers who needed to feed their families without spending hours in the kitchen. The foundation was ground beef, browned until it developed those rich, caramelized edges that would flavor the entire dish. Rice joined the party, along with diced tomatoes and whatever vegetables were available. Onions, bell peppers, and celery, if you were lucky. The magic happened in the oven, where all the ingredients melded together into a cohesive, flavorful meal. Each grain of rice absorbed the beef juices and tomato flavors, creating a dish that was both exotic and comforting. It was filling enough to satisfy the hungriest family members and economical enough to make regularly, even when money was tight. Hamburger spoon-bread casserole. Cornmeal was a staple in Depression-era pantries, and clever cooks found ways to transform it into satisfying meals. This casserole combined the comfort of spoon bread with the heartiness of seasoned ground beef, creating a dish that was both filling and surprisingly elegant. The ground beef layer was seasoned with onions and simple spices, creating a savory base that would support the cornmeal topping. But this wasn't just any cornmeal mixture. It was enriched with eggs and milk, creating a custard-like consistency that baked into something resembling a cross between cornbread and pudding. The result was a dish with contrasting textures that kept every bite interesting. The beef provided protein and flavor, while the spoon-bread topping added substance and comfort. It was the kind of meal that made a house feel like a home, filling the kitchen with aromas that promised satisfaction and warmth. Salisbury steak. Before frozen dinners made Salisbury steak a TV dinner staple, this dish was a way to make ground beef feel like a special occasion meal. The secret was in the preparation, shaping the ground beef into oval patties and cooking them in a rich, onion-laden gravy that made them taste like expensive steaks. The beef patties were seasoned with breadcrumbs, egg, and simple spices, then shaped by hand into portions that looked substantial on the plate. They were browned first to develop flavor, then simmered in a gravy made from onions, beef broth, and whatever seasonings were available. The long, slow cooking process allowed the flavors to penetrate the meat while creating a gravy that was rich enough to serve over mashed potatoes or rice. It was comfort food at its finest, proving that with a little creativity, humble ingredients could create meals that felt luxurious. Mock Swiss steak. When real Swiss steak was beyond the budget, creative cooks developed this mock version that delivered similar flavors using ground beef instead of expensive cuts. The trick was in the preparation and cooking method, which transformed humble ground beef into something that felt special and indulgent. The ground beef was formed into thick patties, then dredged in flour, and browned until they developed a crispy exterior. This created the foundation for the mock Swiss steak experience. The patties were then simmered in a rich tomato-based sauce with onions and bell peppers, allowing the flavors to penetrate the meat while creating a sauce that was perfect for serving over rice or mashed potatoes. The long, slow cooking process was crucial. It allowed the tough connective tissues in the ground beef to break down while developing the complex flavors that made this dish special. It was comfort food that fooled no one about its humble origins, but satisfied everyone who tried it. Potato nest casserole. This clever casserole used thinly sliced potatoes to create nests that held seasoned ground beef, resulting in a dish that was both visually appealing and incredibly satisfying. The potato nests weren't just decorative. They were an integral part of the dish that added substance and helped stretch the meat to feed more people. The preparation required patience but was worth the effort. Potatoes were sliced thin and arranged in muffin tins or small ramekins, creating cup-shaped nests that would hold the beef mixture. The ground beef was seasoned with onions and herbs, then spooned into each potato nest. As the casserole baked, the potatoes became tender and golden, while the beef cooked through, creating individual portions that felt special and looked impressive. It was the kind of dish that made ordinary ingredients feel extraordinary, proving that presentation could be just as important as flavor when it came to making a meal feel special. Pineapple beef bake. The addition of pineapple to ground beef might seem exotic, but this casserole was a practical way to add sweetness and nutrition to affordable ingredients. The pineapple's natural acids helped tenderize the meat while adding a tropical twist that made dinner feel special. Ground beef was browned and seasoned, then layered with chunks of pineapple and rice in a casserole dish. The pineapple juice was mixed with broth and seasonings to create a cooking liquid that would flavor the entire dish. As it baked, the pineapple caramelized slightly, creating pockets of sweetness that balanced the savory beef perfectly. The rice absorbed all the flavors, becoming tender and flavorful. It was comfort food with a twist, proving that even during tough times, cooks could find ways to make meals interesting and exciting. Campfire foil packets. Before camping became a luxury activity, these foil packets were a practical way to cook complete meals using minimal equipment and cleanup. Each packet contained ground beef, vegetables, and seasonings, sealed in foil and cooked over coals or in the oven. The beauty of these packets was their simplicity and versatility. Ground beef was combined with diced potatoes, onions, and whatever vegetables were available, then seasoned with salt, pepper, and herbs. Each portion was wrapped in foil, creating individual meals that cooked in their own juices. The foil trapped steam and flavors, creating tender vegetables and perfectly seasoned beef. When opened, each packet released an aromatic cloud that promised satisfaction. It was a method that required minimal cleanup while producing maximum flavor, making it perfect for families who needed to conserve both time and resources. Egg and beef bake. This hearty casserole blurred the lines between breakfast and dinner, creating a meal that was satisfying any time of day. The combination of eggs and ground beef provided protein, while simple seasonings and vegetables added flavor and nutrition. Ground beef was browned and seasoned, then spread in a baking dish and topped with beaten eggs that were seasoned with salt, pepper, and herbs. As it baked, the eggs set around the beef, creating a custard-like texture that was both rich and satisfying. The dish could be served hot from the oven or at room temperature, making it perfect for busy families who needed flexible meal options. It was the kind of dish that made breakfast feel substantial and dinner feel comforting, proving that the best meals were often the simplest ones. Corned beef hash with ground beef. When actual corned beef was beyond the budget, ground beef stepped in to create a hash that was just as satisfying and flavorful. This breakfast for dinner dish combined crispy potatoes with seasoned ground beef for a meal that was both filling and comforting. The secret was in the potatoes, which were diced and partially cooked before being combined with the ground beef. This created the crispy texture that made hash so appealing. The beef was seasoned with onions and spices that mimicked the flavors of traditional corned beef, including a touch of paprika and garlic powder. Everything was cooked together in a large skillet until the potatoes were golden and crispy on the outside but tender inside. The beef mixture filled all the spaces between the potatoes, creating a cohesive dish that was greater than the sum of its parts. Topped with a fried egg, it became a complete meal that satisfied even the heartiest appetites. Hot dogs and sauerkraut. When meat was expensive, hot dogs were the affordable protein that made families feel like they were eating well. Grandparents would buy the cheapest hot dogs available and stretch them with homemade or store-bought sauerkraut. The tangy, fermented cabbage added vitamins and flavor, while making a few hot dogs feed more people. This dish cooked in one pan, sliced hot dogs browned with onions, then sauerkraut added to steam and heat through. Some families added potatoes to make it even more filling. The combination of salty meat and sour cabbage created a satisfying meal that cost pennies per serving. Kids loved it because hot dogs felt like a treat, while parents appreciated how far their grocery money stretched. This German-influenced dish became American comfort food during hard times when every meal had to count. Creamed tuna on toast. Canned tuna was one of the cheapest sources of protein available, and creamed tuna on toast turned it into a filling meal. A can of tuna was mixed with white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, then seasoned with salt and pepper. The creamy mixture was served over toasted bread, making a complete meal from pantry staples. Some families added frozen peas or diced celery for extra nutrition and texture. This dish was popular because tuna was shelf-stable and didn't require refrigeration until opened. The white sauce made the tuna go further, while adding calories and richness. Children who might refuse plain tuna would eat it when it was creamy and served on toast. Many families ate this dish once a week because it was so economical and easy to prepare. Meatloaf with mashed potatoes. Meatloaf stretched expensive ground beef with cheap fillers like breadcrumbs, oats, or crackers. Eggs and milk held everything together, while onions added flavor that made the dish taste more expensive than it was. The meatloaf was baked in a loaf pan and served with mashed potatoes made from real potatoes, not instant flakes. Smart cooks added grated vegetables like carrots or celery to the meatloaf mixture to increase nutrition and bulk. The mashed potatoes were made with milk and butter when possible, or just water and salt when money was tight. This meal provided protein, carbohydrates, and vegetables in one affordable package. Leftover meatloaf made excellent sandwiches the next day, extending the value even further. Families could eat well for 2 days on one meatloaf, making it a staple of Depression-era cooking. Salisbury steak with brown gravy. Salisbury steak was basically hamburger shaped into patties and covered with gravy to make it feel like a proper steak dinner. Ground beef was mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings, then formed into oval patties and browned. The patties were simmered in brown gravy made from beef broth, flour, and drippings. This dish made cheap ground beef taste more expensive while providing a filling meal. The gravy was often made with bouillon cubes or beef base when fresh broth wasn't available. Served with mashed potatoes and vegetables, it felt like a complete restaurant meal. Some families added mushrooms or onions to the gravy for extra flavor. This dish satisfied the desire for meat and potatoes while staying within tight budget constraints. Canned soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. This classic combination became a staple because it was quick, cheap, and satisfying. Canned soup was diluted with water or milk to make it go further, while grilled cheese sandwiches were made with the cheapest bread and cheese available. The hot soup and crispy sandwich created a complete meal that warmed the body and soul. Families often chose tomato soup because it was the least expensive variety, and the acidity paired well with rich cheese. Some families added crackers to make the soup more filling, or used different types of cheese depending on what was on sale. This meal could be prepared quickly when parents came home tired from work. The combination of hot soup and melted cheese satisfied hunger while providing comfort during difficult times. Spaghetti and meatballs. Spaghetti and meatballs stretched expensive ground beef with cheap pasta and homemade tomato sauce. The meatballs were made small and mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasonings to make the meat go further. Tomato sauce was made from canned tomatoes, tomato paste, and seasonings rather than buying expensive pre-made sauce. This dish was perfect for feeding large families because pasta was filling and inexpensive. Some families added vegetables like onions, peppers, or mushrooms to the sauce for extra nutrition. The dish could be made in large batches and reheated throughout the week. Children loved twirling the long noodles and hunting for meatballs, making dinner time more enjoyable. This Italian-American dish became comfort food that satisfied both hunger and the desire for something that felt special. Beans and cornbread. Beans and cornbread provided complete protein when meat was too expensive or unavailable. Dried beans were soaked overnight and cooked with onions, salt pork, or ham hocks for flavor. The cornbread was made with cornmeal, flour, eggs, and buttermilk when available. This combination was filling, nutritious, and extremely economical. Different regions had their own variations: navy beans in the north, pinto beans in the south, and black beans in some areas. The beans were often cooked all day to make them tender and flavorful. Some families added vegetables like tomatoes or peppers to the beans for extra nutrition. This meal was so filling that it could satisfy heavy laborers who needed lots of calories. The combination proved that simple ingredients could create satisfying, nutritious meals. Egg salad sandwiches. Egg salad sandwiches turned inexpensive eggs into a filling meal that could be prepared quickly. Hard-boiled eggs were mashed with mayonnaise, mustard, and seasonings, then served on bread with lettuce if available. This protein-rich filling was more economical than meat while providing essential nutrients. Some families added pickle relish or celery for extra flavor and texture. The sandwiches were perfect for lunches because they didn't require heating and could be made ahead. Many families raised their own chickens, making eggs even more economical. The sandwich filling could be stretched with additional mayonnaise or even mashed potatoes when eggs were scarce. These sandwiches represented simple, honest food that satisfied hunger without breaking the budget. Conclusion: these 25 recipes tell the story of American resilience during one of our nation's darkest economic periods. They represent more than just food. They're lessons in creativity, community, and the power of making something from nothing. Each dish taught families that survival wasn't just about having enough to eat, but about maintaining dignity, hope, and connection to each other even when everything else seemed lost.